She called me on a Monday morning. Voice smooth. Confident. The voice of a woman who believes she has already won. She said, "I think it's time we discussed your father's estate." I said, "I think you're right." She said, "Everything transfers to me as his wife. I've spoken to an attorney. You should prepare yourself." I let a moment of silence sit between us. Then I said, "Which attorney did you speak to?" She said a name. I said, "You should call a different one." She said, "Excuse me." I said, "A different attorney. One who specializes in trust law and deed transfers and LLC ownership structures." Silence. "Call one of those," I said, "and then call me back." She called back in 4 hours. Her voice was different. "My name is Daniel. 29 years old. My father was James Whitfield. The kind of man who built things slowly and quietly and without any particular need for recognition. He had started a property management company at 32 with 2 rental units and a truck he drove himself. By the time I was born he had 12 properties. By the time I was in high school he had 41. By the time he died at 63. He had built something that took 3 attorneys and an accountant 2 weeks to fully map. My father was not flashy about money. He drove the same truck for 11 years. He ate lunch at the same diner every Tuesday. He wore the same brand of boots for 30 years because they worked and he saw no reason to change what worked. But he was methodical about structure. About documentation. About the difference between what something appears to be and what it legally is. He taught me that difference from the time I was old enough to understand it. At 14 he showed me our first LLC structure. At 16 he explained deed transfers and title holding. At 18 he sat me down with his attorney Gerald and walked me through every entity in the business. "One day this is yours," he said. "I want you to understand it before it is." I understood it. All of it. Including the changes we made 4 years before he died. When Sandra came into our lives. Sandra arrived when my father was 59. He had been alone for 6 years after my mother passed. Not unhappy. Just alone. He was not the kind of man who needed company to feel complete. But Sandra was persistent in the specific way of people who have identified something they want and are willing to invest the time to get it. She was warm on the surface. Kind of. She remembered his preferences. His schedule. The way he took his coffee. The stories he had told more than once. She was performing a role and performing it well. I saw it. My father saw more of it than he let on. We talked about it once. Just once. He said, "Daniel, I know what she is." I said, "Then why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because lonely is its own kind of cost," he said. "And I'm 60 years old." I didn't say anything else. I understood. He married Sandra 14 months after they met. Small ceremony. Immediate family only. Which by that point meant me and 2 of my father's brothers. Sandra's side was larger. Her daughter from her first marriage. Her sister. 3 friends she introduced as family. I stood beside my father at that ceremony and I shook Sandra's hand and I said I was glad he had found someone. I meant part of it. The part about being glad he wasn't alone. The part about Sandra specifically. I kept to myself. Because my father and I had already done something that made the part about Sandra largely irrelevant. My father died 16 months after the wedding. So fast. The kind that does not give you time to prepare or to say the things you did not know you still had to say. I was with him. At the hospital. For the 3 hours between the call and the end. Sandra arrived 40 minutes after I did. She cried in the way of someone who understood that crying was expected. I'm not being cruel about that. I am being accurate. There is a difference between grief and the performance of grief, and I had spent 2 years learning the difference by watching Sandra perform most things. In the weeks after the funeral, the performance shifted. The warmth that had been directed at my father. Redirected. Toward his estate. It started with questions. Innocent sounding. About the properties. About the business accounts. About the LLC structures my father had mentioned to her in general terms. I answered vaguely. Professionally. In the way of someone who is not yet ready to have the conversation but is not going to lie. Then her attorney called Gerald. Gerald called me. "Sandra's legal team is asserting spousal inheritance rights over the full estate," he said. "They believe the properties and business entities transfer to her as surviving spouse." I said, "What did you tell them?" Gerald said, I told them to review the title documents and LLC operating agreements before making any further assertions. I said, "Did they?" He said, "They are reviewing them now." I said, "Good." And then Sandra called me on that Monday morning. With the smooth, confident voice. The voice of a woman who believes she has already won. "I want to tell you about the night after my father's funeral. Because this story requires you to understand what I was carrying before you can understand what I did with it. I sat in my father's house. The one he had lived in for 22 years. The one I had grown up in. The one with the kitchen where he made the same breakfast every Sunday morning and the back porch where we sat on summer evenings and talked about the business and about life and about the things that mattered and the things that didn't. I sat in that house alone. Sandra had gone to stay with her daughter. For space, she said. For grieving, she said. I sat in my father's chair. The specific worn leather one that nobody else ever sat in because it was his and everyone understood that without being told. I sat in it. I thought about 63 years. About a man who drove the same truck for 11 years. Who ate at the same diner every Tuesday. Who wore the same boots for 30 years because they worked. Who had sat across from me at 18 and said, "One day this is yours. I want you to understand it before it is." I had understood it. I had spent 11 years understanding it. Working in the business. Learning every property. Every tenant. Every contract. Every LLC structure. Every deed. My father had not built something to hand to a woman he had known for less than 3 years. He had built something for someone who had been learning what it was since they were old enough to learn. That was not cruelty. That was his right. And he had exercised it. Quietly. Methodically. 4 years before he died. When Sandra came into his life and he looked at the structure of everything he had built. And made some changes. Let me tell you about the changes. 4 years before my father died. 2 years before he met Sandra. My father had sat down with Gerald and 2 other attorneys and his accountant. He had spent 3 months restructuring everything. Every property. Every business entity. Every account. The restructure was not complicated in concept. Only in execution. Every property that my father owned personally was transferred into an LLC. Every LLC was owned by a holding company. The holding company was structured as a family trust. The beneficiary of the family trust was me. Not in a way that excluded a spouse from spousal rights to marital assets. My father was too careful for that. In a way that distinguished clearly and legally and completely between marital assets and trust assets. The house Sandra lived in, marital asset. Hers under spousal rights. My father's personal accounts, marital assets. Split under applicable law. The 41 properties. The property management company. The LLC structure. The holding company. The business accounts. The revenue. The contracts. The relationships. Everything he had spent 30 years building. Trust assets. Established 4 years before his death. Before Sandra. Before the wedding. Before any of it. Irrevocable. Documented. Reviewed by 3 attorneys. Filed correctly in every applicable jurisdiction. My father had told me about the restructure at the time. He had sat me down with Gerald and walked me through every change. "This is for when I'm gone," he said. "However that happens. And whoever is there when it does." He had not mentioned Sandra specifically. He had not needed to. He was a methodical man. He planned for contingencies. Sandra was a contingency he had planned for before she existed in his life. When she called me on that Monday morning with the smooth, confident voice, she was calling a man whose father had protected him from exactly this conversation. 4 years before the conversation happened. She called back in 4 hours. Her attorney was on the line. The voice was different. The confidence was gone. What replaced it was a specific careful quality. The quality of someone who has just read documents they were not prepared for. "Daniel," her attorney said. "We've reviewed the title documents and the LLC operating agreements." "I assumed you had," I said. "The properties are held in trust," he said. "Yes," I said. "The business entities are owned by the holding company," he said. "Yes," I said. "The holding company is the trust," he said. "Yes," I said. "And the trust was established 4 years before my father's death," I said. 2 years before he met Sandra. Silence. A long one. "The trust is irrevocable," her attorney said. "Yes," I said. And the beneficiary is me, I said. Has always been me. Since the trust was established. 4 years ago. More silence. Sandra's voice came on the line. The smooth confidence was completely gone. What was left was something raw. You knew, she said. This whole time. You knew. I said. My father sat me down with his attorneys when I was 18 years old. I have known the structure of this business for 11 years. He set this up to cut me out, she said. Her voice had an edge now. He set it up 4 years before he met you, I said. He set it up for me. Because I am his son. And I have been learning this business since I was 14 years old. And that is not cutting you out. That is called having a plan. Her attorney cleared his throat. Sandra does retain rights to the marital home and the personal accounts, he said. I'm aware, I said. Gerald has the full accounting. Those assets will be transferred appropriately. Everything Sandra is entitled to under applicable law she will receive. But the business was never a marital asset, I said. Was never going to be a marital asset. Was structured specifically and legally and irrevocably to ensure it would never be a marital asset. My father was a methodical man. He planned for this. Specifically. The call ended shortly after. Gerald called me 20 minutes later. How did it go? He said. I said. About how my father expected it to go. Gerald laughed. The real kind. He was very specific about that structure, Gerald said. He said he wanted it to be clear. Not spiteful. Just clear. Was it clear? I said. Very, Gerald said. The settlement of the estate took 4 months. Sandra received the marital home. She received the personal accounts split under applicable law. She received everything she was legally entitled to. Not a dollar more. Not a property more. Not a business entity more. The 41 properties. The property management company. The LLC structure. The holding company. The trust. All of it transferred cleanly to me. The way my father had structured it. The way he had intended. The way he had sat down with 3 attorneys and an accountant to ensure. 4 years before anyone needed to ensure it. Sandra moved out of the marital home 6 months after the estate settled. I understand she relocated to be closer to her daughter. I wish her the version of peace she is capable of finding. The Tuesday after the estate settled, I drove to the diner. My father's diner. The one he had eaten lunch at every Tuesday for as long as I could remember. I sat at his table. The one in the corner. By the window. The one the staff had called Mr. James's table for so many years that they still called it that. I ordered what he always ordered. The same thing. Every Tuesday. For longer than I had been alive. The waitress who had known him for 20 years brought it without me asking. She set it down. She looked at me for a moment. She said, "You look just like him." I said, "I know." She said, "He talked about you. Every Tuesday. For years." I said, "What did he say?" She smiled. "He said you were going to be okay. He said he made sure of it." I looked at the table. At the food I hadn't started yet. At the window in the street outside. At the ordinary Tuesday afternoon going about its business. And I thought about an 18-year-old sitting across from his father and 2 attorneys. Learning what an LLC was. Learning what a trust was. Learning why structure matters. Why documentation matters. Why the difference between what something appears to be and what it legally is the most important difference a person can understand. My father had taught me that. Starting at 14. Continuing until he couldn't anymore. And when he couldn't continue anymore, the teaching was already done. Everything I needed to understand, I understood. He made sure of it. For years before anyone needed it. The way he did everything. Quietly. Methodically. Without any particular need for recognition. Just making sure the right things ended up in the right hands. His hands to mine. The way it was always supposed to be. I picked up my fork. I ate his lunch. At his table. On a Tuesday. And for the first time since I sat in his chair in his house the night after his funeral, I felt something that was not grief. Something that was not anger. Something that was not the weight of a fight I had never wanted to have. I felt him. Sitting across from me. The way he used to. Ordering the same thing. At the same table. On a Tuesday. Telling me what he had always told me. Without words. The way the best lessons are told. You're going to be okay. I made sure of it.